Welcome to the Steps Back to Me podcast. On this show, we talk about all things that empower you to take control of your life and win it. I'm your host, Deb J. On this podcast, we're on a mission to provide guidance, emotional support, and practical tools that will inspire you on your path to living your best life ever. Our guest on today's show is Veronica Vasquez Garcia. She is a social entrepreneur, wellness coach, and the founder of the Social Emotional Learning Dance Method. She is the person who takes traditional dance and fitness, throws it into the air like confetti, and watches it transform into something entirely new, a brilliant fusion of movement, emotion, and human connection. Veronica is a master at taking the rigid structures of fitness, leadership, and dance, repurposing them into one. Imagine combining the best parts of a dance class, therapy session, and leadership retreat into one holistic experience that makes you feel seen, heard, and emotionally connected. In today's show, Veronica shares her story and how her life experiences uniquely prepared her to serve others using her S.E.L dance method. Here is my conversation with Veronica.
I invited Veronica today because she and I were talking the other day and she shared some of her life story and just realized that there are so many women who would identify with her story, if not the details, with the feelings and how she's dealt with it. So welcome, Veronica. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Deb. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Veronica is a wizard when it comes to dance and dance therapy. Tell us a little bit about your story. We were talking the other day and you told me about your dad.
My dad passed away a few months ago after a few months of being in and out of the hospital and wellness center from pancreatic cancer. He had many other medical problems as well. But throughout that time, it was really taking me back to my childhood with my dad. I'm going through the healing process. But seeing him suffer the way that he suffered and seeing people around him, such as the nurses, his wife, just really having a hard time seeing the person that I was seeing who is vulnerable and hurting and just, afraid that he's dying, to the other person that most of the time was talked about throughout my childhood, this addictive personality. My dad suffered from alcoholism and smoking, and he was a social worker, so he had a way with his words, and one of those ways could be looked as manipulative. And through his suffering, he had a way of connecting with the nurses or his wife or whatnot that came across as both, his addictive behavior and his manipulation. And I was seeing this empathetic man coming out, and when I'd sit down and speak to him, he didn't want to talk about how he was sick. He just wanted to talk about, he'd sit up. He was like very, very sick. He almost looked like a carcass. It was really hard on me to go visit him, and he would just sit up. He'd smile. His whole demeanor would change because I came into the room, and he'd be like, "How are you, Veronica?" He's like, "I'm here stuck in this bed, but I'm going to come out soon." I'm like, "Okay, Dad." He'd be like, "How's the weather?" I'm like, "Oh, it's a lovely, beautiful day today. It's sunny." He's like, "I haven't gone out in a while. Can you describe it to me?" I'm like, "Sure, Dad." He's like, "How are the kids? Tell me about them." And when a nurse would come in, he'd say, "Don't you see I'm in the middle of a conversation here? Please come back." He had such an eloquent way of speaking. Anyways,
Well, hold on a second. I like who you're explaining and all of that in his last days, but can you go back and tell us who your dad was to you growing up?
When he passed away, we went back to memory lane, my mom and I. So many pictures, so many pictures of him and I as a baby, just him hugging me. I looked so happy. And when I was 3 years old, my dad didn't come home one day. He just didn't come back home. And my mom, my dad never sat down and told me what was going on. I didn't know what was going on, besides my dad, who I love so much, was no longer at home. And next thing I know, there's a lady that showed up that he introduced me to, and I no longer saw my dad until once a week, every week. I was very sick growing up, so I had medical issues, and that's a whole other story. But being taken apart from someone that you love so much, not knowing what's going on, and all of a sudden being restricted to seeing them once a week. From there on, it was shocking. Like, once a week I'd see him. You know, he had his addictive issues, and there was a new girl in the picture, a girl he adopted, and I couldn't stop but think, she's with my dad, and I get to see my dad once a week. My dad it was like two different people. One was this person that looked, for me, after my parents got divorced, he looked sad. He looked upset most of my childhood. He had such a way of connecting with me. He taught me about God. He would take me to church on Sundays. He would instill in me mindful practices. He would talk to me about empathy. He would put on his social worker hat with me, and that was, that's the best hat he could have put for me, because when he was with me on Sundays, I could say he was present. And one thing that my dad always did was he believed in me. So it didn't matter what anybody had to say about me. He'd always say, I'm not sure what Veronica's doing, but I believe in her, so I know it's going to be amazing. Or, you know that you are smart and beautiful, and I believe in you. He'd always have like a note, Valentine's Day, my birthday, Christmas, we had greeting cards that he would send to me. And so these are the amazing parts about my dad. Now, this other part about my dad, this man that would call me throughout the week and let me know that he was only a phone call away. Oftentimes after 4 o'clock, I knew that the way he was going to speak to me was very differently. And oftentimes he would promised me he was going to take me to the beach, take me to all these fun things that really wouldn't happen. And I would sit for hours on Saturdays waiting for him by my front door. My mom would then come and she'd cry of watching it, and I'd get so mad. And then, as a little child going through a divorce, because I was going through the divorce with them, I would get really mad. I didn't want anybody feeling sympathy for me, so I'd just get up and say, there's no need to cry. You don't need to cry about it. I'm not crying about it. It's okay. And I'd walk away. And that, for me, that's just an example, but there were many other times my dad wouldn't follow through with things he promised me. And sometimes he was very rigid or not show up to things that were very important to me, and he wouldn't apologize. And I know that was, part of his addictive personality. And for me to walk the line and love the unlovable, it modified how I saw things. One is I had a really hard time expressing myself. Or even, I didn't want people to have sympathy for me. I really didn't. And on the other side, I learned empathy. My dad would often tell me his stories. He went through a lot of trauma growing up, a lot of abusive. He came from an abusive household, very, very abusive household. So coming from the stories he would say, which oftentimes he would almost make his oppressor sound like the hero. I'm like, what's going on here? But, and he would talk to me about how he went into therapy. He started wanting to help other people who were struggling. And he became a social worker. He received a master's degree. Now, it didn't take away him not loving himself. And I learned that empathy and getting to know people's stories was so important to me, because oftentimes I realized that for me, when someone hurt me, is so much behind, what you see besides the hurt. It's like, what's going on underneath? And I think that my what I've experienced with my dad taught me empathy.
That's interesting. I want us to put that out there, to remind people of that, because we can get so caught up in our experience or our feelings that we tend not to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. So I think that's good that you're sharing. You've learned that and that you've put that into practice in your life. And I really wanted to look at, you said earlier, as a child, I was going through the divorce too. And I think that's interesting to point out. Sometimes we don't, as people going through divorce, and we need to mention that you are happily married, you're not divorced or going through a divorce, but right now as an adult, but like you said, you did that as a child. What do you say to women, especially going through divorce, who have children? How were you affected by not just your dad, but also your mom and the experience they're going through? And then how can people now who are going through now, who have children, how can they be aware and help their own children?
Oh, that's a great question, Deb. There's so much in there to unravel. So I would say, well, I'm going to start with, when you're going through anything, whether it's a divorce or even in a relationship that's harmful and you haven't taken that step to, like, maybe the divorce is the right step, it's affecting your kids if you have kids regardless. So how it affects each child is different, because each child is different. But my parents had their own struggles they were going through in their divorce, but within that, they were projecting onto me. And there's so many examples. One, they wouldn't communicate with each other, so I'd communicate, like, okay, my dad said this today, well, my mom says that. Or I felt like my own feelings were not validated. And I know so many kids probably feel that way. I many times didn't want to see my dad on Sundays, but my dad was so caught up with his anger with my mom, or vice versa. My mom had so much anger with my dad too, both of them, that when my own feelings were not validated, it would be like, oh, I knew your mom put you to this. Your mom probably told you not to come see me. And so I ended up getting into this little habit, which I don't have anymore, but growing up, of lying, because I didn't feel like what I really, as Veronica, wanted to say was validated, because whatever they saw projecting of the other person was how they were viewing me. And so I felt like they're not seeing me. I can't speak up of who Veronica is. So I would play around with, like, well, let me say this a little bit different, see if they even notice. And then that little personality came out more, like, well, they think I'm in need, so why not take advantage here? And I know that those little things that start off as little become larger, and that personality just becomes larger, right? Because you don't feel validated. How many kids out there probably you see that whose parents might be going through a divorce, and you're like, why are they acting up, or why are they doing these things? Well, maybe they don't feel their feelings are validated, they don't feel seen, so they're acting out because they want to be.
That's really interesting. Wow. I'm a little bit speechless, because honestly, a lot of times adults are, as we're going through our situations, we're so focused on what we're doing that, like you just mentioned, we can end up using our children as pawns in a war. Right. Without even intending to. So it's not even that the intention of the parent, or the mom or the dad, is to use the children as a bargaining chip or as a pawn. And that's something I believe that as As people who are going through hard times, we need to recognize.
Yes. And it's not easy to recognize. I know my mom and my dad wouldn't recognize it. I as an adult had to come into terms and really allow myself to forgive them and recognize and use empathy again and realize, you know what, let me put myself in my mom and my dad's shoes. Like, really, they had no clue they were doing this. That was really not their intention. They loved me in the best way that they knew how. How would I have reacted if I were in their shoes? Would I have done anything differently? Like, maybe I would say I would because I wasn't in their shoes. But if I had the resources, the mentality, and the hurt they had, would I have really done something different? That, though, is really something that most kids will not sit to ponder. So that's just not going to happen. So with your kids, what can you do? For me, something I know helped me as a child and I would do it for myself, is I would start putting myself in activities that got me seeing things differently, but also getting in perspective of other people, and that would help me get like distracted from my pain and being able to turn that pain into helping others. As a parent, being vulnerable and stating the emotion of how you feel and asking them how they feel about it and how maybe they view the situation, and giving them some time to speak about it without judgment, whether their perspective is like in the right lens or not. Sometimes you'd be surprised how many times, like, if you allow kids to really come to a place where they feel heard and they speak up, sometimes their perspective of how they're seeing things could be completely skewed, right? But if you don't allow them skewed, but if you don't allow them to feel comfortable enough to speak about it, then you don't know how they're feeling. Once it comes out, then you're able to be like, oh, this is interesting. Thank you, for mentioning this to me, or for expressing this. I really appreciate you coming out and sharing with me how you feel. Are you open for me to share with you X, Y, and Z? And then you're able to also recognize recognize how you can support them in communicating. I haven't gone through a divorce as an adult, but my son has autism, and it's hard for him to communicate oftentimes like it is for a child who may be going through a traumatic event. And what I tell my son is, Eli, when you make your own assumptions in your head and I'm not able to hear them out loud, I'm not able to recognize if I hurt your feelings because I don't know. I'm like, so when you speak it up and you speak to me, then I'm able to figure out, okay, this is how Eli feels. Then I can help you, and even like maybe there's something that you're thinking that might not be my intention behind what I did, but if I don't know, I can't tell you my actual intention.
Right.
This is the way I speak to my son, but I really encourage parents to maybe, go deeper and speak to kids in a way that, like you would to an older person. You'd be surprised how much they understand and they know.
That's a good point. Yes, and also recognizing, and I'm not sure that everybody does, but recognizing that a lot of the values or thoughts about themselves and their world that children form become a part of their operating system, a part of their personality that grows with them into adulthood. So we would be doing our children a favor engaging with them and helping them as they go along this path. I think it would be important to compartmentalize. You have your divorce, if it's a divorce, or whatever your situation that you're going through, or the death of a loved one, whatever your trauma-making event that you're going through, if you have children, take the time to make space, carve space out for them, to communicate with them, to get their perspective, because believe it or not, sometimes we can also learn from them. We can hear things from their perspective that could help us.
Right. Yes. For me, like, personally, I had and I have a love for God, and it happened, who happened to teach me about God was my dad. Now, my mom would not step into a church when I was a small child. Prior to that, she had a relationship with God. She was really upset for so many years, and I'd talk to her about God. Anyways, years later, as a teenager, she started going to church with me. Prior to that, she would drop me off at church when I do worship dance. She's like, "Well, you have fun. I will pick you up when you're done with this." And she, she speaks about it now. And when she came back to God when I was a teenager, she'd sit down and say, "Veronica, thank you for talking to me about God. Thank you for helping me nurture that relationship again. I was really mad at God. I blamed him for the divorce with your dad, for your dad cheating on me. And it was really something that took me a long time to heal from. And your perspective and seeing you want a relationship with God, regardless of what you were going through, made me want to give it a try." And so that's just an example of of parents sharing with you how you made a difference. And
yeah. So that's a really good perspective. So how did you, and you may have just given us a clue, but how did you go from being that little girl who, sat by the door waiting for your dad, who didn't always show up? How did you, rather than becoming angry and frustrated, how did you become that grown person who now sits at her father's bedside and can see the good in him?
As a child, I struggled with expressing my emotions. And oftentimes I could be described as manipulative. When I started getting into my teenage years and teaching, I started teaching at a very young age. It helped me, almost like therapy, to get out of my own head. And I would recognize right away kids who were going through different troubles. The interesting part about me is that I had my own way of healing through it. And I'm still healing through it, but healing through it that somehow people wanted to hear me. And I recognized that what was called manipulative could be turned around to being empathetic and becoming the person that the other person on the other side needs you to be in that moment in time. And I started learning that, you know what, I'm not manipulative. I know how to shift how I am speaking or how I'm acting so that it can be what that person needs me to be at the moment, so I could be that vessel that God could use, or whatever it is, the person believes in. And that's how that got me to not taking it personal. When I was seeing those same behaviors in my dad, I remember sitting with him and saying, Dad, you are so brave. And he just looks at me. I'm like, you are so brave. I'm like, do you know that you were taken out of your house from one day to another to the hospital? Your alcohol and your smoking, you weren't given access to that. It's been 4 months. You haven't taken any of this. And he looks at me and he's like, what alcoholism? Because him and I always had this thing where I knew he had an addiction. He knew he had an addiction. He didn't want to really talk about it to me, so I'd act like we didn't know he had an addiction. So I go, well, And he's like, Veronica, I haven't had any withdrawal symptoms. And then he smiles and he's like, but thank you for appreciating. And he felt good talking to me. Oftentimes the nurses were saying, can you go talk to your dad, because you're the only person he speaks to amicably. And I'm like, that's very interesting. But I would do that. Saying what as my childhood would be called manipulative, I learned that trait doesn't have to be that. And that's how I got there, was a lot of putting myself in other people's shoes, and it just trial and error, having a belief in God, and learning to love myself. It wasn't something that was taught to me growing up. Both my mom and my dad had a hard time loving themselves. So I had a hard time recognizing what that looked like. And so continuing to be in that search of loving myself has given me so many gifts. Like I had a hard time even seeing myself being married. I remember thinking, when I was a teenager and even a young adult, I didn't believe in marriage. Actually, my husband, when we met, he knew that about me. I'm like, well, I don't believe in marriage, and I'm not even sure if I'm ever going to be in a relationship. That's where I saw myself. But God puts you in front of people that are not where you're at, but that can complement you. My husband, on the other side, he didn't come from a divorced family. His parents have been married his entire life, and I just came with myself as I am, and he came with him. He has his own situations, but with himself as he is, and it's we have brought in and blended both of our stories together, and it's been a blessing. I can say I'm married, and I know what it feels like to not be in a divorce. And I couldn't say that. As a kid, I didn't know what it felt like to have both parents with you.
Right.
So just continuing to learn to love yourself and to unravel your own story.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was trying to make a checklist in my head. Then I started trying to write them down. But you said, put yourself in the other person's shoes, listen to that other person, love yourself. Yep. Those are just a few of the things that I took out of that. And they're really good steps to just say to someone and not to take everything so personally. That was another thing you said. Those are all steps and sub-steps in really healing and moving forward in your life. And I just love that you say nobody really taught you that. I guess God taught you that himself and through other people, even if you weren't in a family situation or have parents that taught you that. One of the things that I've said as a parent and having raised children is that obviously I wasn't a perfect parent. Still, I'm not a perfect parent. My kids are adults now. I also homeschool my children, and a saying I said all the time is homeschool is like a hammock. It has a lot of holes, but it'll hold you up, and you can fill in the holes that you want to fill in your life. And that's kind of what you've done, is filled in those holes and become a person on your journey who is healed or healing, right? It's continuum. So tell me a little bit about how you help children and other people using dance. I find that interesting. You hear therapy, right, all the time. You hear go to counseling, work on yourself. But dance? Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, first, nobody's a perfect parent, Deb.
I agreed 100%.
It's not alone. So, as I mentioned earlier in my story, my dad is a mental health therapist. So, and yet, everything I mentioned, right? So, when I thought about therapy growing, I didn't want to go to therapy. For me, I'm like, yeah, I had my own,
Yeah, it wasn't, to you there was a duality. It's do what I say, not what I do. And that our kids experience that a lot. We experience that a lot. And so in a sense, you didn't want to go to therapy because here is the therapist whose life was in shambles, right?
Right.
And that's kind of the way you were looking at it. So what do you do instead?
So I love dancing, and I had a hard time expressing myself. So I learned to express myself the more I taught other people. And there was this style of mine in my earlier years as teaching that I didn't recognize was coming out of me. And I'm like, why are people, telling me all of these testimonials that have nothing to do with dance? And I have all these non-dancers. Like, I need to learn more about myself. Well, I realized that my dad's impacted the way that I taught. And I was using empathy, life skills, like all these like lessons that he taught me, and therapy, the essence of therapeutic practices with people. So I started sitting down and writing my curriculums down. And I created S.E.L dance method. It's called social.
Hold on. Sorry to interrupt you. Let me back up a little. You said you were a teacher a number of times. Were you always a teacher of dance, or were you teaching other things?
I've always been a dance teacher. My degree's in mass communications and dance. I started teaching dance at the age of 16, and I was a past dance studio owner. I opened up my studio at the age of 19, and I at the same token, was in a leadership academy in those earlier years, and I was taught with the City of San Jose Recreation Department, so there was a large recreation component I knew. I then went into becoming a personal trainer, group exercise instructor, so I've been teaching dance, fitness, wellness for 18 years.
Okay, so now tell me how you parlayed your dancing into helping other people heal.
So I created S.E.L dance method, social emotional learning through the tools of dance. And I placed it into my nonprofit called JMM Dance. What we do is combine social emotional learning skills and teaching kids how to express themselves with specific affirmation lessons and mind-body connection. And then we'll use the tools of dance so that they're connecting the mind and the body. But we're not teaching them dance for skill. So we won't go into, it's not a regular dance class where we're just warm up, across the floors and then choreography. Instead, we start with affirmations. We go into a group discussion on a lesson that has to do with life skills. Then we'll do a warm-up, stop. Then talk about how we feel about what we were experiencing, how our mind and our body is connecting with it. Then we will put songs that talk about affirmations, go into a few exercises of different dance styles, compare how is my body translating this type of style as opposed to the other. We go into discussions. Basically, what I find is so many kids are often like deer on headlight, like, you want to know about how I'm feeling right now? After a few sessions, they're like, let me tell you how I feel. And
that's amazing.
What's really amazing to see is how after a few weeks, kids will start expressing themselves and say their own stories and then feel confident in their own bodies. So that's so amazing to see, because to me, that's the best way we can help people. If they can feel confident in expressing themselves, then we're going to have, these amazing people growing up to be whatever they're called to be. That has nothing to do with dancing.
Do you do that kind of therapy, or is there that kind of therapy available for adults too?
Yes, actually, I do have an online program called S.E.L Dance for Healing. So using S.E.L Dance for Healing, and it's geared for adults. And what's cool about it is you get to support JMM Dance by with the membership, and you get to come online with myself and a licensed therapist, and we do the S.E.L dance method together.
That's very interesting. I love that that's part of what I intend to do with this podcast and this show, is to let people know that there are resources, maybe different resources than they are familiar or have heard of. So this is good to hear that there is another type of therapy. So there may be people who are trying to find themselves again on their healing path, for whom programs such as yours would be really helpful. How can somebody, let's say, well, I am in a situation where I can't really come online or really get with Veronica. Can someone do this on their own or start along this path on their own?
Yeah, definitely. Here's 3 things I would suggest to do on your own. So, one is, when you wake up in the mornings, find something to be grateful for. Find something to read, and I'm just saying what I personally do. Sit down, open up a journal, and start writing all the things that are good about you. And you know what I find is, at first that could be kind of hard to do. And when you're writing that, I like to go into the mirror, and this is part of what I do in the classes, and I'm amazing, I am wonderful, I am so prepared for the day, and I have the ability to do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So that's just like one affirmation. Whatever it is for you, like find something positive to say about yourself, go into the mirror and say it. That in itself can be so hard. Like the things I just mentioned, they're easy to do, like as a task. Emotionally to do, whole different story. And so when you start training your mind to find these positive attributes of yourself and then say them out loud, the last part to add to it is the movement. So you then you get binaural beats, any type of music you want to get, and associate the affirmations you said about yourself, then start moving, whether it's swaying your arms, whether it's lifting your arms up, finding a pattern that you start to feel goes with how you're feeling about yourself. Combine those together. I know I just said a lot of things, but
no, that's really, really good. That's something, steps that's really doable, and that's very, very helpful. Veronica, thank you so much for sharing just your experience, your life, your story with us, and also giving us something fun to do that'll help on our journey toward taking steps back to ourselves.
Thank you, Deb, for having me. It's been so awesome to, connect.
Thank you so much for joining us on another powerful episode of the Steps Back to Me podcast. We hope you found inspiration and insights that will light your path on your journey of healing and self-discovery. And as we wrap up, always remember your story is a tapestry of strength, resilience, and hope. No matter where you are in your journey, you have the power to reclaim, reinvent, and recalibrate your life. Until next time, keep taking those steps back to the authentic you. Stay strong, stay inspired, and keep shining your light. I'm Deb J. Goodbye for now, and see you on the next episode of Steps Back to Me.